December 24th, 1838, Pointe-a-Coupe Parish, Louisiana. The most cursed Christmas Eve the Bayous would ever remember. In the heart of the plantation fields, where sugar cane bowed under frost and the smell of molasses clung to the damp air, a slave named Evelyn, once a girl of quiet devotion, would carve her name into blood and fire. The masters called her obedient, a shadow in a woman's shape. By midnight, they would call her butcher, sorceress, and heretic. Before dawn, the walls of the big house would glow not with candlelight, but with inferno, summoned from a ritual older than Christ. This is the true story of the woman who slit the throat of a goat, whispered curses into the dark, and turned the master's feast into a funeral pyre. But before we continue with the video, don't forget to subscribe, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. The end, you must decide. Was she monster, martyr, or memory carved into smoke? Christmas Eve on the plantation carried two faces. In the great house, pine branches dressed in ribbons perfumed the air, and the heavy mahogany table sagged under roasted goose, candied yams, and sweet wine poured into glass cut sharp as diamonds. Laughter rolled through the hall, a sound of clinking spoons, silk skirts brushing polished floors, the careless mirth of men and women who believed the world itself bowed to them. A fiddle sang from the parlor, its notes rising like smoke, wrapping around voices that toasted to harvests and fortunes. Beyond those walls, another gathering festered. In the slave quarters, mud walls sweated frost. The dirt floors were packed hard as stone, where families huddled close to the ember glow of a dying fire. The only feast was cornbread blackened at the edges and broth thin as swamp water. Children gnawed bones already scraped bare. Men stared at calloused palms, cracked open from cane knives. The women's songs were whispers now, lullabies choked off, for no one dared disturb the drunken joy spilling from the master's house. The contrast bled into every sense. The smell of sugar roasting in the big house was a taunt to the stench of damp straw and smoke in the quarters. The heat of hearth and candelabra mocked the shivers of those who slept beneath ragged quilts. Where violins danced in the distance, silence reigned heavy, broken only by coughs and the scrape of a rat. Even the stars seemed uneven, shining brighter above the master's roof, as if heaven itself kept distance from the fields. It was here, in this chasm between worlds, that Evelyn sat apart. She watched the horizon, where cane fields turned into shadows, and the distant glow of lanterns painted the house in false holiness. She could hear the laughter spilling through open shutters, bright and careless. She could feel the cold gnawing her bones, each bite reminding her of what she was denied. And in that contrast, in that split of warmth and ruin, something inside her began to burn. Not envy, not hunger, but the slow coal of wrath waiting for its breath of air. Evelyn had long been mistaken for meekness. Her silence was read as obedience, her bowed head as surrender. Yet within her skull, thoughts burned like scripture written in ash. She had learned early that survival demanded masks. The lowered eyes, the yes ma'am, the unbroken rhythm of hands cutting cane. To the master's wife, she was the quiet one who never answered back. To the overseer, she was a shadow that passed unseen. But in her own marrow, she carried a ledger of wounds, and every lash, every stolen breath of freedom was written down in red. Her mind was a cathedral of memory. She remembered the night her sister was dragged screaming into the big house, her cries stitched into the walls. She remembered the old man Isaac, whipped until his back split like bark, his groans swallowed by cicadas. She remembered hunger gnawing so deep that she chewed the husk of corn like a dog, her stomach a drum of emptiness. These things did not break her. They hardened her like clay set to fire until she no longer prayed for mercy, but for reckoning. Evelyn did not see herself as powerless. She carried within her veins stories older than Louisiana, older than chains. Her grandmother had whispered them, tales of fire spirits, of blood sacrifices that called down justice when no man would deliver it. She had listened, wide-eyed, as the old woman spoke of offerings at midnight, the way the world itself bent when a name was spoken over flame. To the masters, these were superstition. To Evelyn, they were scripture, proof that heaven had not abandoned the enslaved, but armed them with secrets too dangerous for white ears. What stirred within her now was not sudden. It was the accumulation of years, like water dripping onto stone until it carved a canyon. Each insult, each night of hunger, each scream muffled by darkness had deepened the fissure inside her. On this night, Christ, Maz Eve, the contrast between their feast and her famine was too sharp to bear. She felt it in her pulse, a drumbeat rising behind her ribs. Not envy, not sorrow, but a clarity cold as steel. She would not endure another winter bowing. The time for silence had ended. Before fire ever entered Evelyn's hands, it had settled first in the hollow of her chest, slow as a coal, warming the memory of a single touch she could not let die. Years earlier, when she was scarcely more than a girl with knees still soft from play and a voice that had not yet learned to swallow itself, she had known a boy named Samuel. He was the kind of bright thing that appears in places meant for dimness, quick with a grin, low with laughter, his voice steady as the river that cut through the parish, able to steady her when the world tilted. In the stolen hours between son and overseer, beneath the ribs of overturned carts and hidden in ruined tobacco barns, they stole a life from the plantation's margins, a map of promises scrawled on the backs of leaves, plans whispered like contraband. Samuel's hand found the small of her back. His laugh was the small kindness that made the fields bearable. Where other comforts were thin and rationed, he was abundant. Together they carved hope out of those furtive moments, a whispered promise to one day run, to follow the old oaks and the secret rivers until the stars themselves showed mercy and the taste of freedom lasted beyond a single night. Samuel was her anchor, her breath, the warm place in a cold world. But on plantations, even the warmest things are measured and priced. Dreams do not survive where human bodies are counted as assets and songs are taxed with whips. The master's life was a ledger. Men came and left according to profit margins. When debt leaned over the household like a hungry shadow, Samuel became currency. Without warning, without mercy, men with ledgers and ropes came at dawn. Evelyn had been threading reeds for a basket when the wagon rolled like an omen into the yard. She saw him haltered and shackled, saw the way the sun caught the metal on his wrists, saw the open-mouthed pleadings of boys who, the wound did not close. It festered in the dark places where a person keeps what cannot be spoken. Night after night, she returned to the clearing where they had once planned escape routes by the positions of stars rather than by clocks. She would press her palm into the earth where his bootprints had once been, feeling for the ghost of his weight. The ghost answered in the small ways, a memory of his thumb, the scent of pipe smoke, a laugh like a low bell. Her grandmother's voice threaded itself back into those nights, the old woman's phrases rising from memory like an incantation. Blood is a covenant, and what is taken in blood must be repaid in blood. Those words, spoken long ago over a bowl of bitter tea, found purchase and took root. Samuel's absence became not a vacancy, but a presence inside her, a hollow that no prayer or hymn could fill. From that hollow grew a seed that was not grief so much as a slow, metallic taste, vengeance, cool and precise. As seasons turned, the plantation itself seemed a conspirator in the betrayal. Every lash sounded like Samuel's last cry. Every feast in the big house was a rebuke, its scent of spiced meats and sugar a knife that cut through her reverie. She dreamt of flames, but not the ravenous, chaotic blaze of accidental fires. These were fires of purpose, lit with intention and prayer. In those dreams, Samuel stood near her, his chains dissolving into heat, his eyes bright as though struck by a smith. He spoke in silence, his command a pressure at the back of her bones. Burn it. Burn them all. When she woke, the dream clung to her like ash. By the winter of 1838, the shape of her mourning had changed. Tears came less and less, sorrow refined into something sharper. Evelyn no longer clung to the hope of reunion. She sharpened her sorrow into a blade she could carry without waver. Samuel was gone from the world of flesh, but his absence had given her an iron purpose, to turn mourning into memory, memory into reckoning, and reckoning into flame. Evelyn moved through preparation, like a priestess moving through rites she had learned long before she could read the master's ledger. It was not a sudden frenzy, but a slow, holy choreography, hands learning the weight of things, the cadence of concealment. She gathered in the dark, a strip of cloth from a discarded shirt, a length of cord, a hollowed gourd that once held molasses. Objects ordinary enough to pass a glance, yet chosen for what they could hold of intent. Each item hummed with purpose when her fingers closed around it. Her grandmother's talismans came next, a small iron ring blackened by age, a scrap of bone wrapped in oilcloth, a coil of hair bound with twine. These were not mere superstition. In Evelyn's mind, they were signatures, ways to write her name on the night. She spoke to them softly as she dressed them, names, not pleas, rolling from the rough streets of her throat and falling into the dark like seeds. With each name she repeated, the feeling in her chest tightened, a bell calling her closer to the edge. She visited the goat at dusk, a creature as stubborn and patient as the earth. There was no cruelty in the way she handled it. Her touch was gentle, a covenant between two beings who understood debt. The animal's breath steamed in the cold. Its eye reflected the low, patient fires of the yard. Evelyn sang to it in a low voice, a song her grandmother had taught her, a litany of names, of harms counted, and debts recorded. The goat's quiet seemed to accept the account, and in that acceptance, Evelyn felt the scale tip, if only by a fraction. She sharpened a blade she had kept hidden beneath the floorboards, not with instructions, but with the ritual of rubbing and hearing the small, satisfied rasp. She wrapped the handle in cloth stained by sweat and moonlight until it fit her hand as if it had always belonged there. Around her neck she tied the iron ring, feeling its cold against skin that had never known true warmth. The preparations were both mundane and sacred. A stolen candle stub, ashes gathered from the hearth, the hush of footsteps practiced until they made no sound at all. As midnight approached, Evelyn rehearsed the litany beneath her breath, not naming targets but naming debts, hunger, chains, the cartwheels, Samuel's voice. Each repetition was a sharpening, not of tools, but of will. When the night finally leaned toward action, she did not think of mechanics or how to burn a house down in technical terms. She thought only of balance, of the tally being set right, of smoke carrying her ledger of names up toward a sky that had long favored silence. To set fire to a house is one thing, to burn its keepers is another, and Evelyn treated the difference with the cold arithmetic of someone tallying debts. She knew their names, as one knows the names of the weather, necessary, inevitable, and always coming. She had watched them across the years, watched their faces settle into masks of entitlement, noted the small, habitual violences that coagulated into a life lived by other men's bones. She studied them as one studies scripture, not to worship, but to parse meaning, to find the exact phrase that would justify the act to herself and to whatever gods might listen. Each face was a passage, each habit a footnote. To strike the house was to strike a ledger. To strike its keepers was to strike the entries that had cost her everything. There was Master Henri, the patriarch, a man as round and steady as a ledger page. His wealth had padded him into an arrogance that looked like flesh. A belly press against waistcoat, fingers stained with molasses and ink, a breath that smelled of brandy and old tobacco. He moved through rooms as if they were chapters, and he, the author, turning people into punctuation marks. Henri had a laugh like a bell rung in a tavern, loud, easy, unconcerned with those outside its ring. He had sold Samuel as if selling a horse. His pen had scratched the boy's future into profit margins. No man's heart breaks as loud as the sound of silver, he'd boasted, a proverb for the comfortable. Evelyn kept his phrase like a stone in her mouth. Henri's name was the heaviest on her list. She would be the voice that read it aloud in smoke. Mistress Clarice presented cruelty as couture. She draped herself in silks dyed the color of pomegranates and wore a smile that tasted of vinegar. Her violence arrived in small stitches, a withheld bread, a tightening of a collar on a Sunday morning, a mocking caress that left marks deeper than any lash. She fed the hounds and let the children of the quarters go hungry. She gave sugar to her lapdogs and gave contempt to the mothers who stuffed their skirts to hide the sharpness of their ribs. Once, when a boy mispronounced a name, she had laughed and told Evelyn, "You're prettier when you don't speak." The words had slipped into Evelyn like a splinter. Clarice's jewels flashed against her throat like promises of indulgence. Evelyn imagined them melting into a river of metal and then cooling into the ash that would bury them. The sons were beginning men and full of the inherited rot. Marcel, broad-shouldered and still laughing too bright for his age, took sport where others took sorrow. For him, sport was a predator's cruelty, chasing children through the cane with a riding crop, the sound of their feet and their frightened breath a music to his pleasure. He learned to measure the distance between a shriek and a challenge, and then to push it. Louis, quieter, watched. He did not need to shout. He organized the cruelty. He knew when to hold the rope, when to let it slacken. Youth did not exempt them. It carved them. Evelyn watched the seeds of their future brutality sprout from small seeds of mimicry, and she saw that burning the house would not only remove them, but warn whatever men followed. Cruelty can be repaid. And then there was old Aunt Beatrice, whose body seemed stitched from the farm's old timbers. She moved as if she carried the history of cruelty in her back, knuckles like knotted roots, voice a rasp that could thin the air. She wore morality like armor. She taught restraint as a weapon. It was she who had tutored Clarice in the economy of humiliation, who had taught Henri to prefer spectacle to subtlety, who had whispered to the sons that order required display, that lash and feast were the same coin. Beatrice was the older generation of rules, the one who kept cruelty institutional. If Henri was the hand that wrote the law, Beatrice was the voice that read it aloud and taught others how to obey. Evelyn's mind did not hold them as whole people. They were entries, debts, names in a ledger of harms. Henri, Clarice, Marcel, Louis, Beatrice. She did not imagine them wailing and tearing at their gowns. She imagined them silent, their authority dissolved into ash and smoke until nothing of their power remained. In her mind, each profile became an ember fanned by memory. Henri's log, Eter, Clarice's silk, Marcel's riding crop, Louis's watchful silence, Beatrice's rasping counsel. For every face she catalogued, she gathered fuel. The old indignities, the sold brothers, the sharp words, the nights of cold and full bellies elsewhere, and piled them in the dark like kindling. The act was not of malice for malice's sake. It was a settled accounting. She would balance the scales with fire, and in the ledger of her chest, each name would be crossed out by smoke. Midnight settled like a verdict, heavy and absolute, a thin film of frost whitening the cane and sealing sound under its glassy skin. The quarter's marrow convulsed in sleep. A single lantern guttered, then died. Evelyn stood as if she had always been poised there, blade warm from her grip, goat tethered and breathing slow at her hip, breath making small moons in the cold air. The world beyond her shoulders narrowed to two sounds, the distant careless laughter from the master's house and the beat of her own heart, steady as a drum beneath ribs hardened by winter and grief. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath, as if the night itself recognized some change in balance and waited to see how the tally would be paid. She knelt upon the packed earth where the soil still remembered old footfalls and younger promises. The goat smelled of hay and the faint musk of animals who knew nothing of human bargains. Its breath fogged in the air between them. Evelyn's hands were ceremonial, not rough with haste, but deliberate, each motion measured from lessons learned in hushed rooms where elders had taught the young how to keep secrets. She pressed the animal's head to the ground, feeling the quick thrum of life against her palm, and then, with a single clean motion, honed in private and purpose, she opened its throat. The blood came hot and immediate, steam rising where it met, the knife edge cold. It sounded, for a heartbeat, like a small metallic rain on the dry leaves. The scarlet pooled, then ran, beating into the earth as if writing a ledger that only she could read. As the red flowed, Evelyn whispered names into it, syllables shaped as invocations and accounting both. Henri. The consonant struck the night like a nail. Clarice. The vowel fell soft and terrible. Marcel. Louis. Beatrice. Each name was a bell. Each bell told an old grievance. The whispers Rhea, tapped around the blood and were absorbed by the soil, which drank as the world had refused to. Samuel. Taken. Children sold. Feasts eaten on hollow stomachs. When the final drop stilled, and the surface of the earth closed over it with slow, hungry greed, Evelyn felt the night itself lean toward her, attentive as an audience that had been waiting long for its story. She rose with the gourd in her hands, now heavy with oil and intent. Her steps through the cane were a practiced hush, the stalks parting without complaint, like curtains drawn for something that had always been scripted. The blade was folded against her thigh under the skirt, a secret of need. Lanterns on the house threw rectangles of warmth into the dark, false stars pinned in wooden frames, their glow spilling like a promise meant for those within. The scent of roasted goose, of sugared plums and marmalade seeped into the night, a perfume that had always been a taunt. It braided with the smoke from other fires, the cooking hearths in the quarters, and for a moment the world tasted like the lie it had learned to wear, plenty for some, bone for others. At the rear of the house, Evelyn paused, feeling the architecture of cruelty as plainly as one might feel a throat. She struck flint to a stub of tallow candle with hands that did not tremble, coaxing a tiny, fierce flame into being. The light was small and white, as if ashamed of itself for what it was about to do. She touched it to the oil-soaked cloth bound about the gourd's neck. For an instant the wick drank the oil like a living thing taking hold. Fire blossomed in the dark, bright and hungry, licking the cloth until it caught and seemed to remember its elemental vocation. She set the first offering to the wooden siding with the tenderness of someone placing a votive on an altar. One ember became two, then three. They found the dry timber as a secret must be revealed, quick and inevitable. Inside, mirth unraveled into confusion with a cruelty of its own. Voices swelled and then broke. Orders were barked. Then panicked questions took their place. A shout rose, Henri's, thick with command and disbelief, a sound meant to assert control, but which only revealed its absence. Panic has a high pitch, it slices the nacres. Clarice's cry was a different thing, sharp and petulant, the sound of someone surprised that the world answered with ruin rather than indulgence. Marcel and Louis burst into the doorway as if into a stage, their bravado clattering like toys, then dissolved into coughing and fear when smoke found them. Even Beatrice, used to giving judgments with the steadiness of a metronome, let out a small, thin wail that carried like a hymn before the wind stole it. Evelyn did not flee. She remained in the yard as the first tongues of flame began to climb, light painting her face in oranges and ruin. The heat found her, and with it came the clarity she had carved out of years. The ledger was set, the tally taken, the names paid. Flames raced along the eaves, caught the rafters, took hold of the heartwood, and the house sang the old song of timber and tinder. Glass shattered into sparks that flew like frantic stars. Timbers groaned, the sound of old bones protesting their own end. Evelyn watched, unblinking, the inferno reflecting in her eyes, and whispered once more into the rising smoke, the words clear and small against the roar, "Samuel, it is done." By dawn, the plantation wore a different face, not of order and wealth, but of ruin. The big house, once a monument to indulgence, was now a skeletal husk. Its timbers groaned in the soft wind, smoke drifting low and thick across the cane rows like a funeral shroud. The air still stank of charred oak and scorched flesh, acrid and unrelenting, a perfume no wind could sweep away. What had been laughter and silk only hours before had collapsed into silence and cinder. Roof beams jutted upward like broken ribs, black against the pale morning sky. Ash clung to the grass like frost, soft and deceptive, and in it glimmered fragments of what had been jewels, pearls, ornaments, their sheen now muted, their value reduced to dust. The masters' names, once carried with reverence and weight, were reduced to whispers, spoken with awe, fear, and something near disbelief. Henri, Clarice, Marcel, Louis, Beatrice. They had been kings and queens of this narrow kingdom. Now they were ash, unnamed but for what the smoke carried. And Evelyn, she was no longer hidden in the fields, no longer the shadowed girl whose silence had been her shield. She was fire incarnate, fire with a face and hands, and fire cannot be concealed once it has taken hold. She did not flee into swamp or forest. She did not scatter like frightened prey. Instead, she remained. When the overseers stormed the quarters, torches in one hand, rifles in the other, their boots pounding out the rhythm of fury and fear, they found her already waiting. She knelt in the dirt like a priestess at the altar of her own making, hands smeared with soot and streaked with blood, the marks of her covenant visible on her skin. Beside her lay the goat's skull, blackened, half-scorched from the flames, its hollow sockets staring as though it too bore witness. Evelyn's eyes, steady and unblinking, met theirs without fear. To the white men, she was madness embodied, a witch, a vessel of the devil, proof of their worst superstitions. But to those who stood in the shadowed doorways of cabins, watching silently, she was something older, deeper, prophecy fulfilled. No words passed her lips when they bound her wrists in rope and dragged her through the haze of smoke. She held her silence like a blade. In that silence lay her final weapon, heavier and sharper than any chain they clasped around her. The trial came quickly, as it was meant to. It was less an act of judgment than of theater, performed to reassert control. In the courthouse, beneath ceiling fans that creaked as though they too despised their labor, the jury barely feigned deliberation. They were men who had dined at Henri's table, men whose pockets bulged with the same coin that had purchased Samuel's bondage. Witnesses spat words, sharpened by fear. Sorcery, devil's blood, witch. The charred bones of Henri and Clarice were paraded like relics, displayed not as evidence, but as spectacle, their ruin proof of her guilt. A minister, sweating through his collar, thundered that Satan himself had guided Evelyn's hand, that the fire was not of earthly kindling, but hell's own flame. Yet through it all, Evelyn did not speak. She did not grant them a confession, did not ask for pardon. Her gaze drifted past the men, past their righteous venom, to the square of light that fell through the courthouse window. It stretched like an open door across the dusty floorboards, a threshold that only she seemed able to see. The sentence was already etched before she entered the room. Death by hanging. Swift, certain, final. But though the verdict was inevitable, it was not what carried. The whisper of her act, the sheer audacity of her fire, moved faster than rope or judgment. It spread through the quarters, slipped down the cane rows, and traveled to other plantations like an ember borne on wind. Her name became a torch passed from mouth to mouth. Evelyn, the woman who called fire. Evelyn, who wrote justice in smoke. Evelyn, who dared to make the masters scream. To some, she was cursed, a dangerous spirit whose path promised only ruin. To others, she was saint, chosen vessel of retribution. Yet whether cursed or sanctified, she was remembered. Memory itself became her immortality. On the morning of her execution, she walked barefoot down the dusty road, the rope trailing behind her like a bridal veil, an adornment both mocking and holy. The crowd gathered, white faces twisted in anger, some in satisfaction, some in fear, and their voices rose in jeers. Yet in the spaces between their shouts, another sound stirred, a low hum, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind in the cane. It came from the enslaved who had slipped into the crowd's edges, from the quarters, from the shadows. A melody threaded with mourning and defiance, too quiet to stop, too steady to be ignored. It was a song older than chains, carried in whispers, in breath, in bone. Evelyn's eyes lifted once, and though her lips never moved, she seemed to join them. When the trapdoor fell, her body swung, but her story did not. The rope creaked, the crowd roared, but above them lingered the stronger truth. Smoke had been loosed into memory, and smoke does not vanish. It clings, it lingers in fabric and in air. It enters lungs and refuses to be forgotten. In that smoke lay her message, carved into the marrow of those. He who had seen her, fire could answer chains, and chains could break. Evelyn's breath was gone, but her flame remained, smoldering in the silence that followed. The ruins of the master's house were sifted at first light, though no one wished to linger near them. The overseers, red-eyed and trembling with both fury and exhaustion, prodded at beams still hissing with heat, turned over fragments of roof that collapsed under their touch, and cursed the acrid smoke that stung their lungs. Where once there had been velvet curtains, now there was only a lattice of char. Where once polished silver gleamed beneath candlelight, there were twisted lumps of metal, fused and dripping into the ash like wax melted from a votive. The furniture, carved with pride from mahogany and oak, lay smoldering, its edges curled and blackened as though gnawed by invisible teeth. The house did not stand so much as haunt, a skeletal shape of beams, ribs exposed, spine cracked, its silence heavier than any noise it had ever known. The contrast cut deepest in the air itself. Hours before, the night had echoed with shrieks, glass shattering, men bellowing commands, women wailing prayers. Now there was only silence, silence broken only by the hiss of a collapsing joist, the soft crumble of ash giving way beneath a boot, the muffled cough of men choking on smoke still rising from the ruins. That silence became a sound of its own, oppressive, spectral, the silence of judgment already delivered. To stand in it was to feel the weight of what had happened, as though the air itself carried the memory of screams and would not release them. Survivors came stumbling forward, pale and trembling, recounting in half-coherent gasps what they had seen. They spoke of charred corpses, blackened shapes curled as if in prayer, teeth bared in a rictus where laughter had once lived. They spoke of Mistress Clarice's rings welded to bone, of Henri's face gone unrecognizable, his waistcoat buttons melted into his chest. They pointed out silver goblets collapsed like tin, candle, abras twisted as if by an angry hand, and remnants of food, a goose carcass half burnt, sugared plums reduced to tar. These relics were more than evidence. They were offerings left behind by the fire, tokens that testified to both indulgence and its undoing. Neighbors arrived before long, riding in on horseback, their hooves clattering against frozen ground. They pulled kerchiefs across their mouths and whispered as they surveyed the scene, their voices thin and brittle. Some muttered of curses, of dark rites pulled from Africa's soil and planted in Louisiana's swamps, of spirits awakened by sacrificial blood. Others shook their heads in awe, calling it an act of God's vengeance, punishment for pride. Each rumor layered upon the next, the whispers rising like smoke into the morning sky. To witness such ruin and still find reason in it was impossible. They needed myth to explain it, and Evelyn had given them myth in abundance. It was then that her captors brought her forth, wrists bound, face streaked with soot, but eyes unbroken. They dragged her past the wreckage, forcing her to look, forcing her to breathe in the stink of burned wood and bodies. They hoped to see a flinch, a tear, some crack in her mask. But Evelyn's face was stone. Her gaze moved once across the ruins, steady, slow, deliberate, as if she were cataloging not the destruction but the completion of a ritual. To her, the house was no ruin. It was an altar spent, a covenant sealed in flame. The ritualistic atmosphere hung heavy, undeniable. Every beam pointed like an arm toward the sky. Every curl of smoke resembled incense. The survivors, the neighbors, the overseers, all of them moved as if unwilling participants in a ceremony too vast for them to name. And at its center was Evelyn, silent, bound, yet elevated by the enormity of what she had wrought. The fire had turned her crime into liturgy, and the ruins of the master's house stood as her scripture written in ash. By mid-morning, the story of the fire had already outpaced the smoke rising from the ruins. Word galloped across plantations, carried in frantic whispers and shouted warnings, until every porch, parlor, and pew knew the name of Evelyn. Among the white gentry, horror spread like infection. They gathered in drawing rooms still heavy with the scent of scorched air, brandy glasses shaking in their hands, their lace handkerchiefs pressed to trembling mouths. What had happened was not, to their minds, mere rebellion. No, rebellion they could understand, rebellion they could hang and whip back into silence. This was something else. This was ritual, deliberate, and steeped in symbols they could not decipher. To them, Evelyn was no longer a woman. She was a witch, a demon cloaked in soot, an emissary of the devil who had conjured flame out of blood. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers demanded militias, new patrols, harsher laws. Their words spat through clenched teeth. Hang her at once. Make an example. Burn the body so nothing remains. Their horror turned quickly to rage, for rage was the only balm they trusted against fear. Yet beneath the gentry's thunder of condemnation, another current stirred, quiet but unyielding. In the slave quarters, where voices were trained by necessity to whisper, Evelyn's name was passed from tongue to tongue, not as an accusation, but as prayer. At first, it was spoken with caution, a name too dangerous to linger on the lips. But as the day lengthened and the shadows deepened, the whispers grew bolder, softer, yet sharper, as though saying her name might summon both strength and punishment at once. Evelyn, the woman who called fire. Evelyn, who broke the master's house. To some, she was a saint, proof that the impossible could be done. To others, she was terrifying, for if fire could answer chains, so too could fire consume. Those who dared to dream of freedom without the strength to match her courage. Awe and fear braided together until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Children huddled close to the embers of cooking fires, their wide eyes reflecting the flames as elders told the story in low tones, weaving it into a parable before it had even finished unfolding. The men, hardened by years of lash and toil, felt a shiver crawl through them at the thought that one of their own had struck a blow so fierce it demanded the world stop and look. The women, who had borne grief in silence for generations, felt both dread and pride. Dread of the punishment sure to follow, pride that the fire had been lit by a woman's hand. In that tension, Evelyn became larger than herself, not merely a captive awaiting execution, but a figure untouchable, already belonging more to legend than to flesh. Thus the two worlds looked upon the same fire and saw different revelations. For the white gentry, it was an abomination, proof that the enslaved were not just restless, but possessed, dangerous, in need of ever tighter chains. For the enslaved, it was proof that chains could burn. In those hushed quarters, Evelyn's silence at her capture was interpreted not as defeat, but as sacred defiance, the silence of someone who had spoken fully in the only language that mattered. Flame. Fear and awe coexisted like twin shadows, one cast by terror of retribution, the other by the blinding possibility that resistance could be more than a dream. Evelyn had become both warning and promise, witch and prophet, demon and deliverer. Her name a whispered psalm that would not be silenced, no matter how swiftly the gallows rose. The cell was no larger than a grave, a square of stone and shadow pressed together by iron bars that bit cold into the damp Louisiana air. Straw scattered across the floor did little to soften its hardness. It stank of mildew and rats, the sour scent of confinement. The walls, mottled with damp patches, seemed to close inward with each passing hour, and yet Evelyn sat, as though the space around her had no hold. She did not pace as others did. She did not claw at the rust or beg for water. She sat still, spine straight, her gaze pinned to a single patch of wall, as though beyond the stone stretched some horizon invisible to mortal eyes. Guards grew uneasy at the sight, shifting in their boots when duty called them to pass her cell. They muttered to one another that she did not blink enough, that her silence was heavier than screams. "She's not right," one spat. "She's seeing something we can't." Another crossed himself each time her eyes met his, whispering a prayer meant to ward off devils. To the masters and their men, Evelyn was already becoming something more than human, and that unsettled them more than her crime. Yet, in the quarters, the story of her stillness was another kind of testimony, carried by those who risked everything to creep near the jailhouse walls. At night, women with baskets on their hips shuffled past, pretending to discard scraps, but tucking folded messages beneath the stones, prayers, psalms, and promises scrawled in hurried hands. A few dared to hum beneath her barred window, low songs of mourning, the kind sung at burials, their voices trembling but unbroken. Others brought morsels of food, slipping them through cracks in the bars when no guard watched. These offerings were not meant to sustain her body, for all knew her body was already condemned, but to honor the spirit she carried, to say in their small gestures, "We see you, we believe. You are ours." And still, Evelyn gave nothing back. Her lips remained sealed to the living, her silence as deliberate as the night she lit the house. Only when the moon rose high, when shadows stretched long and the world fell quiet, did her voice stir. Then, soft as smoke, she spoke the names that tethered her soul to both past and flame. Samuel came first, whispered like a lover's breath, as though summoning him back into her presence. Then the names of the dead, those broken in fields, those beaten in barns, those buried without marker in earth too tired to remember. Each name was a thread, and Evelyn, in her solitude, wove them into a tapestry of memory that neither iron nor rope could undo. Her cell became a shrine, her silence a ritual, her whispers a litany that refused to let the dead fade into nothing. By the time dawn pressed pale fingers through the bars, the myth of her had already outgrown her flesh. To the guards, she was a witch who communed with unseen powers. To the enslaved, she was priestess and prophet, carrying every name that ever mattered on her tongue. Alone in her cell, Evelyn was no longer merely awaiting execution. She was preparing, composing her final act, not in fire this time, but in silence and memory, a work just as enduring as the blaze that had consumed the master's house. The courthouse did not resemble a chamber of law so much as a stage, a wooden theater erected for spectacle and sentence. Its benches creaked beneath the weight of townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces damp with sweat, their collars wilted in the suffocating Louisiana heat. The air was thick with the mingled smells of ink, dust, and bodies pressed too close, an atmosphere not of order, but of frenzy contained by ritual. Ceiling fans turned slow and useless above, their blades whining, offering no relief from the heaviness that settled in the room. Every sound seemed amplified, the scuff of boots on pine floors, the wet cough of an old man, the impatient tapping of a cane. Even before the trial began, the crowd leaned forward, hungry for drama. Evelyn was brought in chains, her wrists bound in iron, her ankles clinking with every step. Yet her entrance was not that of a criminal, but of an unwilling actress thrust onto the stage. Gasps shuddered through the benches as she was led to the front, not because she struggled, but because she did not. Her head was unbowed, her eyes calm, her silence unbroken. She moved with the gravity of someone who had already passed through judgment and emerged beyond its reach. The deputies might as well have been escorting a queen to her throne, though the chains rattled like funeral bells. The lawyers wasted no time donning their roles. Words like witchcraft, sorcery, and Satan's hand flew from their tongues with rehearsed ease. They painted her not as woman, but as vessel, a body possessed by hellfire, a danger to all good Christian order. Each phrase was met with murmurs, clucks of disgust, and the occasional gasp of horror from the gallery. The priest, red-faced and sweating beneath his heavy collar, stood and called for cleansing, not just of Evelyn, but of the entire quarter, his voice rising to a sermon, his finger jab, bing as though exorcising demons only he could see. The jurors, men of land and coin, performed outrage with practiced gestures, shaking their heads, muttering under breath, pounding the benches with fists at every mention of blasphemy. Their verdict was not sought so much as staged, the trial of foregone conclusion, wrapped in the trappings of holy theater. Yet through it all, Evelyn said nothing. Her silence was not meek but monumental. Where others shouted, she breathed steady. Where others sweated with rage, she sat cool, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the walls. It unsettled them more than curses would have, more than pleas for mercy could ever achieve. In her stillness, she inverted the stage, for it was not she on trial, but them. Every clumsy accusation fell against the shield of her composure. Every dramatic gesture revealed their own fear more than her guilt. To many watching, it seemed as if Evelyn were the true judge, her gaze the gavel, her quietude the sentence. And in that silence, the courthouse transformed from a theater of condemnation into a confessional of dread, where the masters and their priests revealed the trembling foundations of their own power. The gallows rose from the earth like a wooden skeleton, beams stripped bare of grace, rough-hewn and splintered, the color of old bone. Its frame groaned in the morning wind. A scaffold meant not just for death, but for theater, a place where the town might gather and feed upon a single body, offered up like sacrifice. The hemp rope dangled thick and coarse, its fibers frayed from years of use, darkened by the oils of hands and the sweat of condemned throats. At its end, the noose swayed gently, whispering in the breeze, a pendulum counting down, not just seconds, but centuries of silence and subjugation. Each creak of wood was louder than sermons, heavier than judgments. It was the sound of inevitability. The crowd swelled around the platform, men in waistcoats, women shading their eyes with gloved hands, children hoisted onto shoulders to see better. Their noise was constant until it wasn't, a rising swell of jeers and mutters that collapsed into uneasy quiet as Evelyn appeared. She walked barefoot, the dirt cold beneath her feet, the rope trailing behind like a bridal veil. Her chains clinked in rhythm with her steps, steady, deliberate, as though each rung of the scaffold ladder were not a climb toward death, but an ascent to something else. Onlookers craned their necks, expecting struggle, expecting tears, expecting curses hurled at the sky. None came. Evelyn's silence had followed her here, heavy as a storm cloud, pressing against every chest until their breaths grew shallow. At the top, she turned her gaze to the horizon. In that moment, time itself seemed to falter. The hangman adjusted the rope, tightening the knot with hands that shook more than they should. The air smelled of pine tar and sweat, the wood beneath her feet hot with sun, the crowd holding its collective breath as if bound by the same invisible cord. Evelyn did not see them. She saw Samuel. In her mind, he stood at the gallows edge, unchained, waiting, his eyes lit by something greater than sorrow. His presence was not phantom, but promise, a reminder that what was stolen could never be extinguished. The hood was never lowered. She met the rope with eyes wide open, her neck bare, her face unmasked. The world contracted to a single instant. The drop, the snap, the violent stillness that followed. The rope tightened with a sound that cut sharper than any shout. And then, silence. No jeers, no cheers, not even the expected applause of vengeance fulfilled. Only the creak of wood and the hush of wind, the kind of silence that makes the living remember they are mortal. The crowd shifted uneasily, as if something had gone wrong, as if death had not claimed her, but released her into something larger. In that silence, Evelyn became more than body. The flesh twisted at the rope, but the story uncoiled, alive, uncontainable. She was no longer the woman led in chains. She was fire remembered, justice written in ash, vengeance that could not be buried. The gallows killed her, but in doing so, they freed her from the narrow frame of a single life. She became myth, a name that outlasted wood and rope, carried on breath and song. The crowd dispersed, but the silence lingered. And in the quarters, in whispers and in hymns, Evelyn lived, larger than flesh, larger than fear, larger than death. The fire does not stay buried in ash. It lingers, here, now, alive in the marrow of memory. Evelyn does not belong to the past alone. She walks with us still, a figure carved not in stone, but in smoke. Her silence is not absence. It is presence sharpened, echoing across time like the toll of a hidden bell. You can feel it when you hear the hiss of a flame catching, when you see wood darken and split, when the smallest spark swallows the dark. That is Evelyn speaking. That is her vengeance whispering through generations. Look around you. The fire has never left. It flickers in every act of resistance, in every whispered name that refuses to die, in every breath that will not be silenced. Evelyn is there, in the strike of a match, in the hush before thunder, in the refusal to bow. The masters are gone, their house ash and ruin, but Evelyn remains, not as flesh on a rope, but as fire carried forward. Fire is fear, yes. It consumes, it devours, it leaves nothing untouched, but fire is freedom too. It clears, it purifies, it sears chains until they break. Evelyn knew this, and so she gave herself not only to the rope, but to the blaze that cannot be extinguished. And now I speak to you. Her story is not a tale to be tucked away in history's attic. It is a mirror held up to every age, a question asked of every witness. When cruelty rises, will you remain silent or will you burn? Evelyn's silence was never passive. It was flame contained, waiting for its moment to roar. That is the lesson she left. That silence can be more terrible than screams, that in stillness lies a fire too vast to smother. To remember Evelyn is to feel the heat of that fire on your own skin. To remember Evelyn is to understand that vengeance does not vanish, that reckoning waits with patience older than time. To remember Evelyn is to remember that silence can burn. Subscribe not for her death, but for the memory of those who dared to fight.